higher than the bottom 1% globally. If the 10% of global emitters were to reduce their carbon footprint to that of an average EU citizen, you will cut emissions by 33%. And that's the kind of inequality we are talking about. Oxfam report that came out recently revealed that how 62 people own the same amount as half the world. So how the concentration of wealth is increasing. Naomi's book talks about, so this changes everything, talks about capitalism versus climate. So we'll be hearing more from her. Some of us who are engaging at the UNFCCC level, which is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have been putting a lot of pressure on all countries, particularly rich countries, to reduce their emissions and also provide finance and technology to developing countries so that they can adopt a much more greener and cleaner pathways. At the same time, communities who are getting affected because of climatic impacts, they should also be supported. But unfortunately, there has not been much action from the developed country side. If you put together all the commitments that have come onto the table as part of Paris Agreement, US has committed to do just 1/5 of its fair share. In fact, as civil society and social movements, we calculated which country should be doing how much. And US and also EU, which is normally seen as a champion in the field of climate change, EU's contribution, if you calculate its fair share, is just 1/5. That's the commitment they're making. And Japan is even worse. It's 1/10 of the climate action it is undertaking. Another interesting thing that we should know, not really interesting, probably painful thing, that US and Canada are responsible for 4% of population increase between 1980 and 2005, whereas emissions have gone up by 14%. So while you keep hearing that we are talking of ambitious actions, so one, we need to look at these actions against the fair share, and then whether these emissions have increased or decreased. And when you put it against the population, you would find that, in fact, the emissions, per capita emissions from the rich world continue to increase. Now, Paris Agreement does talk about keeping the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, in fact, puts an aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's the warming limit. But as I said, if the actions don't match the words, and if we continue to emit the same way, in 6 years, we will have locked in ourselves of at least 1.5 degree of warming. So we don't have many years left, and we are still talking and not really taking action on ground. So what does that 1.5 degree mean? So there are a number of studies. There was a recent study done by Institute for Atmospheric and Climate Science in Zurich that says the risk of what was once in 1,000 days hot weather has already increased 5-fold. And if we touch 1.5 degree, it will double. And between 1.5 to 2, it will double further. So the impacts are not linear. So it's not that 1.5 means 1.5 times of 1 degree Celsius warming. It's going to have a multiplier effect. Nobody probably knows, and that kind of research is already on, which means we are going to face a lot more extreme heat waves. Our dwindling food stocks are going to go down further. Sea level rise, which is going to destroy coastal communities and economies around the world. So what do we need? We need real action. And unfortunately, at the UNFCCC level, we see countries coming forward with different kinds of solutions. Some you can classify them as greenwashing, and some as false solutions. You hear about geoengineering. You hear about how we can capture the carbon from the atmosphere and store it somewhere in the oceans or deep in the earth. We're not tackling the elephant in the room, and that's overconsumption. And I did share the data how people in the West or the rich people around the world, how they are over consuming and occupying that space, which should be shared equally and equitably among all citizens of the world. And the moment you bring in the consumption debate, all the numbers that we keep hearing, particularly now when emissions are increasing from the developing countries, we hear about India's and China's of the world. If you start looking at the consumption data, and that's true for US, Canada, EU, that most of the emissions that we are seeing are responsible because of the consumption patterns. And in fact, China, that's producing a lot of emissions, they're largely to meet demands here in the West. And I think we should be mindful of that when we talk about how we should be sharing equitably the carbon space or atmospheric space. So what do we need to do? We need to transform our energy systems. And at the same time, when we are transforming, we need to ensure that the transition that we are making from dirty energy to clean energy is just. While there is a lot of talk about emission reduction and mitigation, we should not forget that helping the impacted people and making sure that the impacts that they are facing are addressed, on one hand, preparing them well in advance, and at the same time, people who do get impacted, how they get compensated and supported. And these are extremely important elements of the climate action that we talk about. And we need to seriously clamp down on the wasteful consumption. And we are not hearing much about it. Since we are talking about youth have they have a lot of stake both now and in future. So we have a couple of colleagues here who will be talking about it. So I'll not go deep into that. But we really need to bring in a massive change in our lifestyle and put pressure on our government and world's government to make that shift. And what the greatest need of our time is a society that puts dignity and freedom before profit. And that's what we should be working towards. We must pay heed to what Mahatma Gandhi said a long time ago, that Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's, and I'll keep saying man's, every man's needs, but not every man's greed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Harjeet. Can everybody still? Oh, okay, everyone can still hear. All right, perfect. Thank you very much again, Harjeet, for that. As Harjeet was saying, we actually do have two youth activists who are active, have been active in Montreal, have also been active in the Global South, in Bolivia, and in Peru. So I'd actually like to introduce next Adrian Fernandez Jauregui from Bolivia originally. Is where he was born and where he lived until his last year of high school, which is when he moved to Canada to pursue higher education. He did his undergraduate degree at the College of the Atlantic in Maine in the United States, where he studied global environmental politics and also participated in a number of UN events, such as COP19, COP20, and so on. And he did this actually with the youth collective known as Earth in Brackets. This is also the time when Adrian joined the global campaign to demand climate justice. He is now based in Montreal and a member of a different groups such as Climate Justice Montreal, which is more grassroots oriented, and also Tierra Activa for Latin America. What's interesting about that is we actually have two members of Tierra Activa here today. This afternoon, we have Tierra Activa more Latin America, and we have Tierra Activa more from Peru, which Maria will be exposing on just after Adrian. So we're kind of going from the macro down to the local in our presentations today. So thank you, Adrian.
Thank you everyone for coming here today. Well, I'm here to talk about my experiences, my views on inequality and climate change. But before I get into that, I just wanted to reiterate why am I talking today. I am talking today, and I was not supposed to, because Mutetelenu is not here. And he's not here because he didn't get a visa. And he's not the only one, as it was already mentioned. About 70% of people from developing countries who applied for a visa didn't get it. And what is a World Social Forum if the Global South is not present, is no longer the World Social Forum represented. This panel is about inequality and climate change, which are not abstract topics. Real people are experiencing these topics. People like Mutetelel, who was supposed to come here to talk about his experiences, but now actually his absence talks about the inequality because it was this inequality that prevented him from moving from across borders and being here today. That's why I want to invite again for everyone to join us at tomorrow's demonstration to question Canada why it's like doing these ridiculous policies on immigration. Now, unfortunately, this situation, the visa problem, is not unique. It's not just for the World Social Forum. I think this is rather a systemic issue, and is the default attitude of northern governments towards people from the south. Just look at Europe. Look how they are treating people fleeing war, political instability, and as well as climate change impacts, both the ones that are happening slow and the ones that are happening fast. And how are they responding? Instead of showing solidarity, they are closing their borders. They are cutting the budget of the coastal guard in the Mediterranean, which is akin to murder, because we know that thousands upon thousands of people have drowned in that piece of water. And what is worse, now fascist governments dare to blame the internal problems on the refugees. I don't think that's a refugee crisis, but to me that's a European empathy crisis. Now, welcoming refugees to Europe is not just a matter of empathy. I think is most importantly a matter of responsibility. Europe bears some of the responsibility for the wars, political instability, and yes, also climate change. So after European governments bomb entire cities and distribute guns like candies, the least they could do is to welcome people that have lost their houses. This is interesting, this idea of unfulfilled responsibilities from northern countries to southern nations as a form of inequality. And I think it's not just in the context of now what's the European empathy crisis, but also in other issues like climate change, as Harjit was mentioning, and what happens in the UNFCCC. Just another take to what Harjit was already mentioning. Climate change is the result of reckless exploitation of natural resources, particularly fossil fuel, to create economic wealth. We know that most of that wealth generated over the past 150 years, which is the time period during which we started changing the balance of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, has been captured by northern countries, especially like governments, elites, and large corporations. They reap the benefits, whether the extraction took place in Europe and North America, or in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Pacific. So the benefits were unequally distributed. On the other hand, you have the direct impact of resource extractions and the impacts of climate change that are disproportionately felt and endured by communities in the south, also in the north, also especially marginalized communities in the north. The irony is that some of the least responsible nations, meaning the least developed ones, the ones that didn't exploit resources, are the ones that are most impacted. They are the first ones to be hit by typhoons, to lose their homes to the rising sea, and their crops to the breaking heat waves. And that's just unfair. Now, making it a bit more personal, I am from Bolivia, home to one of the first glaciers to go extinct. It's called the Illimani in the Andean mountain chain. And also home to one of the recently defunct lakes called Popo. The Popo Lake was the second largest lake in Bolivia. This lake had been around for thousands of years, way before Bolivia was established as a country. And for hundreds of years, a number of communities depended on these resources and lived normally for all this time. So it hurts me to know that that all these ecosystems and the life that they supported were lost. And it hurts me even more to think of these communities that used to live and depend on these resources, whose livelihoods depended on what provided both the glacier and the lake. They have lost it all. They can no longer stay where they are. They have been forced to migrate, to move somewhere else. Many of these communities relocalized in the cities, small towns. Many ended up going to the mines because that's where there are jobs. And if you think about it, they had nothing to do with climate change, and they didn't cause it. They had no responsibility. They didn't benefit from it, but here they are losing it everything. I think this is a clear example of how inequality is expressed in climate change, similar dynamic. And of course, there is no compensation. Who's gonna pay back for it? Well, and also, when you think about it, this is only gonna get worse, right? We know that as we pass new thresholds in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we also pass new thresholds in terms of global warming, which translate to greater impacts. And it to be terribly sad and unfair. Luckily, governments of the world realized that this was a problem, and they came together at the United Nations, and they addressed climate change. They fought polluters, rectified the inequalities, and developed countries took responsibility for their actions, and now they are leading in the effort to reduce emissions and doing everything they can to compensate communities, including these poor communities. That's not true. That's not what happened. That's not what's happening. But that's kind of what I hoped when I went to the COP for the first time. I was studying about these issues. I was like, a little cynical, but definitely not to the extent that I am now. Yes, that's true. That's true. Framework of the United Nations that Hajid was talking about, the space of the institution of the United Nations that addresses climate change, has these big meetings every year, and they're called the COP. This is the meetings where they make decisions, and maybe you heard of the last one in Paris, the COP Paris, COP21. I don't want to repeat some of the things that Harjit said already about the type of policies that were adopted in these meetings, but I just wanted to mention some that are more important for me. Is targets. Do we want to address climate change? Yeah, sure. Everyone says yes. What are the targets? The targets are inadequate. They are not what's needed to prevent for to prevent climate change so that other communities don't have to be removed from their places, don't have to migrate, don't have to leave behind everything they had. Also, it's especially in the last one, a lot of responsibilities in terms of who has to reduce emissions was transferred now to developing countries. Harshit was mentioning most of the responsibility in terms of who emitted CO2 gases was on developed countries, but now there is a closer distribution in terms of who has to take action. There is no finance, no money to help these communities that were impacted, and of course no compensation. In a more personal experience, just very quickly, it was kind of weird to be in a space like this one, because most people don't get to go. Like, you have to have a lot of privilege. You have to be lucky to be able to get into these conferences because of the cost, because of the bureaucratic processes to get in, and so it was kind of weird to step in this place and to realize what was happening and how disconnected it is from what is happening on the ground. Also, it was awkward to navigate so once you get in, you realize also that it's so, the representation inside these places, even though it's supposed to be kind of international, it's not quite so, especially when it comes to views. Like, you can be from a country, but that doesn't say everything about how you think or how you perceive things. And that's something that, when you get to these spaces, there are certain voices that are lacking. And it seems like a conversation between some that might be from different countries, but kind of agree in views sometimes. For the youth also, I found a lot of the other youth that I met in these spaces, I couldn't connect in the same way. And it seems that there's this bizarre expectation that youth have to be depoliticized, that because you're youth, everyone agrees on kind of superficial attitudes of like, yeah, save the world, and let's do a photo about that one, and then let's, I don't know, kind of naively optimistic, which I think is not useful. I think people have to be active, and it's important to maintain a good attitude, but being naively optimistic is definitely not the solution. I've been talking a lot about inequality between northern nations and developing nations. But for sure, this is not just the only type of inequality when it comes to climate change. There are, whenever there is this power imbalances where some can exploit resources, they can take actions that benefit themselves and negatively impact others, but there is no retaliation, no justice, then there is this type of climate equality, and we see it everywhere. We also see it here in Canada. The example that comes often to mind is that a lot of Indigenous communities here in Canada are being disproportionately impacted by the extraction of oil. That comes from the tar sands, right? Whether it's because they're extracting in their territories or because the pipelines are passing through the territories, and even if they don't agree to it, they are often forced to these kind of deals. As most of you know, like, sometimes dealing with these like massive issues can be daunting. I think when you realize, well, these issues are so big and I'm so small and I have so little power, it can be paralyzing. And you feel important. That's something I found, whether that was these UN spaces or any specific locations. I find that community is critical. When you have a supportive community, other people in your situation, then these feelings are shared and somehow they feel less or like more manageable. They are not paralyzing. You still have them, but they are not like, they don't take you down. It feels like you feel stronger. Um, in these UN meetings, I met some great people. A lot of them are right now sitting in this room, and I really enjoyed working with them and like learning a lot from conversations and supporting each other in what we are doing, whether that's at home or at these spaces, and feeling empowered to be like, no, we disagree with what is happening, so we're gonna just like, we're gonna say it and occupy the spaces there at COP to shout and demand and say like, hey, but you guys are not doing enough, or this is, we're gonna call horseshit. This is not, these are false solutions. Now also being part of now Tierra Activa Latin America, I felt like I started to reconnect more with my region because I haven't lived there in a while, although I come every now and then. I feel like being able to connect with activists in and around there is and help from afar, like it's possible to help. You don't have to be there necessarily with a, like, and go to sit-ins. You can help with logistics, helping mobilize resources, communication, etc. And here too in Montreal, I'm part of a collective called Climate Justice Montreal, and that was one of a space that opened their arms to and received me, and I felt like welcome when I was here, like coming to Canada to Montreal and kind of finding a place and then being able to do stuff was great. So if you have not joined a group yet, and but you care about these issues, I really encourage you to join a group. There are a lot of good stuff happening all over. Like here in Montreal, like there's Climate Justice Montreal, which is really cool. It's a youth collective. There's also the Live Manifesto. They're doing some really cool stuff. Every now and then there are activities. So you should just keep track of it, and whenever there's an opportunity, just join, do something. And maybe more broader, just not just in Montreal, there is the global campaign to demand climate justice, which I've been part of, and it's been just great, as well as Reclaim Power, which I'm really happy to talk about it after this talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Now we're going to actually go down from the macro a little bit to more local to Peru with María Ñope. So, María Ñope es una joven activista peruana y ex dirigente estudiante en la Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos. So, in English, María Ñope is a young activist from Peru. She used to lead the student movement at the major national university of San Marcos. She was also one of the founders of the collective Nuqui. So Nuqui means Mother Earth in the indigenous language Awajun. And through this collective, they actually try to bring kind of environmental problems into the political agenda. And they also try and actually touch on a lot of indigenous issues, things that touch their territory and their identity. She also works for Alternativa. So Maria has an interesting combination of working as an activist in the social movements, but also working with a non-governmental organization called Alternativa, which is actually a partner organization as well for Oxfam in Peru, which I had forgotten to mention. This is where I work, and that's where I kind of come from. So she also works for Alternativa, and what they actually do is they do a lot of work to conserve forests in Peru. Utilizing this vision of an alternative vision of development, an alternative vision of how to manage resources. Maria is also part of the Tierra Activa movement, which Adrian is also part of, but at the global level. And what they do is essentially they, form youth networks and really try and do lobbying and influence on the policy level. But in Maria's case, it's more on the level of Peru. And so now what we're going to do is Maria is going to talk, and I'm not going to remember everything that Maria says, so we're going to do little bits and I'll just interpret. And that's how we're going to continue with the presentation.
Hello, good afternoon, hola, buenas tardes. I prefer to speak in Spanish because I can express better. But now I don't know if it's a better decision. So let's see.
And we have a presentation as well. And we also have other friends from... I'm speaking in Spanish now. Y también, we also have other friends from Tierra Activa who are here from Peru who are also part of the movement. So they're right in the front of the audience there. Hello, Majandra. Hello, friends.
Okay. Mi presentación, yo vine a Canadá con un grupo de compañeros peruanos que pertenecen a organizaciones en Perú que trabajan en el tema más de participación política, así como también en el arte.
We'll do little bits at a time because I probably won't remember everything that you're saying. So she actually comes with a number of different youth who are part of different movements in Peru. And that's who she came to Canada with, who essentially are very active in youth participation and trying to influence.
Okay. Entonces mi exposición va a ser un poco más acerca del panorama político social en el cual estamos inmersos actualmente después de una campaña electoral muy fuerte en Perú.
So what's interesting about Peru is that it's actually coming out of a very interesting electoral campaign. So her presentation is kind of going to give a social and political panoramic situated within this current political context, which actually makes it very difficult for youth organizations to mobilize around climate change issues.
Como ustedes pueden ver, en Perú tiene una población de 27 millones de habitantes aproximadamente, y en Lima está el 30% de la población, que es 8 millones, de los cuales por lo menos 1,5 millones de personas hasta el 2007, entre el 2011, no trabaja, tampoco estudia.
So kind of following a little bit of the information on the slide here, why are we talking about the importance of youth and the importance of youth involved in climate change in the Peruvian context? Well, they do represent 30% of the population. So it's not a negligible number, and that's people who are under 28 years old. And in Lima, which is the mega city of 8 million people, there are 1.5 million people who actually are not working and are not studying.
Entonces, el contexto en el cual nos encontramos es, primero, en lo político. Luego de casi 6 a 7 meses de constante lucha social para impedir que el gobierno o la continuidad del gobierno fujimorista, que viene de una dictadura entre los años 90 al 2000, no continúe en el gobierno. Tuvimos que salir a las calles a través de organizaciones como el Foro Juvenil de Izquierda y otras organizaciones juveniles y sindicatos para generar mayor debate y conciencia social de lo que implicaría nuevamente que el gobierno de Fujimori asuma el poder.
Okay, so in Peru, actually, they're just coming out of 7-8 months of very hardcore mobilization and influencing. Now, this is in a political context where actually the daughter, Keiko Fujimori, was leading in the polls. So who's Keiko Fujimori? The daughter of an ex-dictator who's currently in prison for crimes against humanity, for sterilizations. We're talking about, taking away labor rights. We're talking about a lot of really terrible things that happened in Peru. And so the political context in Peru was essentially a fight so that Keiko Fujimori wouldn't enter into power. So young people, youth-led organizations, unions, and unions, sindicatos. So unions, youth organizations, and another really important organization that was kind of leading the protest was the Foro Juvenil de Izquierda, which is a youth-led organization as well. So they were essentially trying to influence in public opinion, get some very important themes in the debate that were just completely absent.
Ahora nuestro contexto, aunque incierto, pero nos plantea grandes desafíos. A pesar que el gobierno de Fujimori tiene casi 72 bancadas de las aproximadamente 120 que son en el Congreso, o sea, representa la mayoría. Esto plantea, según varios analistas, diversos escenarios que pueden ser positivos para la sociedad civil y la lucha, pero que también puede ser algo negativo porque pueden ellos, como bloque, parar e impedir que cualquier ley progresista o que trate de reformar algunas políticas ambientales que nos han afectado no continúen.
So the political context, although Keiko Fujimori did not win the elections, she does actually have 62 out of 120 seats in Congress. So what does this mean? This means that any kind of progressive laws that come into place in Congress can actually be blocked by these Congress people from her party. So there's kind of a debate right now in Peru of what does this mean for civil society? Is it a positive thing in terms of, reinforcing maybe some of the left, or are we not actually going to be able to really move forward on any kind of progressive laws or policies because of this domination of Keiko Fujimori and her party?
Voy a resaltar tres cosas del contexto, ya que ustedes lo pueden leer, que es las leyes en cuanto a la economía, a la agricultura familiar. Esto representa para los pequeños productores un riesgo de no sentirse respaldados frente a la política estatal debido a que hay una mayor inversión priorización en la siembra de monocultivos, lo cual va o no es equivalente a la lógica de los pequeños productores que tienen una siembra diversa y no siempre en grandes cantidades.
So one of the laws or policies that's really affected small-scale agriculture is the fact that family agriculture isn't what what the state is really investing in. They invest in big agribusiness, monocultures, and they don't really invest in small producers, even though about 73% of the food that Peruvians are eating is coming from small-scale production from family farming. So there's no kind of importance given to the diversity of seeds and small-scale production and family production.
Lo segundo es el paquetazo ambiental, es la ley 30-23-0. En Perú lo conocemos como el paquetazo ambiental, lo que permite que la mayor inversión de empresas privadas y flexibiliza la economía para continuar la inversión, sobre todo en zonas muy frágiles y vulnerables como la Amazonía peruana.
So we all remember Omnibus Budget Bill C-51, right, which deregulated a lot of environmental legislation. Peru actually has their version of this as well, and it's called La Ley 3230. So this is a perfect example of state capture where big industries were able to lobby and push forward this law, 3230, which deregulated a lot of environmental legislation, and especially in vulnerable areas in the Amazon and in different areas of Peru.
Sí, actualmente nosotros tenemos una estadística de que aproximadamente 50.000 barriles han sido derramados en la Amazonía entre el año 94 y el 2016, lo cual afecta a diferentes poblaciones que no tienen accesos y conexiones con otros pueblos cercanos, lo cual para llegar hay que hacerlo en bote, quizás 1, 2 horas, casi un día en ocasiones.
So you may have heard during the Oscars, there was some talk of an oil spill. Well, since in Peru in the Amazon, now since 1994 to 2016, approximately 50,000 liters or 50,000 barrels of oil have spilled in the Amazon, with very little accountability, very little responsibility. What does this mean for some of the indigenous population living in the Amazon is that they're actually left behind with like essentially plastic clothing where they're supposed to be cleaning out a lot of the waterways themselves. So yeah, that's another kind of example of lack of accountability.
Lo otro que es importante para nosotros es la ley, lo conocemos la ley Pulpín, que es el 3028-8, lo cual también generó una gran movilización social debido a que esta ley permitía que las empresas incorporen a los jóvenes como parte de su grupo de trabajadores, pero a su vez lo que generaba o lo que permitía que les permitía hacer era que no cuenten con seguros sociales, seguros médicos, pensiones, lo cual en Perú es muy común que un joven de 20, 22, 23 años, 25, tenga carga familiar. Entonces, con un salario de 750 soles, el cual hace unos 3 a 4 meses ha sido subido a 800, no puede sobrevivir en una ciudad como Lima, donde la mayoría se gasta mínimo entre 1.000 y 1.200 soles al mes.
So another really important law in Peru was kind of coined as the Ley Pulpín. So Pulpín is what they call young Peruvians. It's kind of a slang term. And the Ley Pulpín, what it was trying to do was encourage youth employment, but through actually taking away labor rights for young people. So taking away things like healthcare, taking away some of their vacation, or all of their vacation, not giving them actually any right to vacation, and giving them essentially like a lower salary as well. Now what Maria was saying is that for a lot of Peruvians between 20 and 25 years old, it's quite common for them to already have some sort of family that they need to support. So these changes that they were trying to push forward, and which they actually managed to push forward, like the law got passed, had a very negative effect, especially on young people who already had family responsibilities.
El mayor logro de esta ley es que, a pesar de haber sido promulgada, debido a las marchas que se hizo, a toda la suma de personas que se sumaron, a toda la acción, fue derogada.
So what's amazing about this law is that through massive collective action, protests out in the street, this law that actually was passed was removed, and this is the first time in decades that social movements have had this kind of impact in Peru, and it's the first time in the history of Peru that they've managed to actually remove a law that had already been passed. So it was a very encouraging moment for youth collective action, youth social movements, because they actually succeeded in removing this law.
Bueno, por último, nuestra economía está basada y sigue basada en una política y en la explotación de recursos naturales. Dependemos de la explotación de minerales, de la explotación de la tierra, del agua, con la ampliación de hidroeléctricas, lo cual está generando grandes cambios, impactos en algunos ecosistemas, probablemente únicos, como lo tenemos en la selva, en la Amazonía, pero también ecosistemas no tan importantes a nivel nacional, pero que conservan especies endémicas como son bosques secos en el Perú, donde está la pava blanca, que es una especie en extinción a nivel mundial. Debido a esto, nosotros contamos actualmente con un promedio de 200 conflictos a nivel nacional, de los cuales el 70% se basan en conflictos socioambientales.
All right, I might not get all of the numbers correct here, but Peru remains a very resource extractive heavy country, which was great, you know, when prices for petroleum and metals were high, but that's no longer the case. So Peru's actually entering a time of recession. So a lot of the the advances that they made in terms of, getting people out of poverty, a lot of those people are actually still very vulnerable. There's hydroelectric projects, which are very contested because these have a very negative environmental impact, not only in the jungle, but also in forests. And there are endangered species, a type of white endangered species bird that's endangered globally, that also lives in the specific forest that is endangered because of these hydroelectric projects. And then there's currently 200 or over 200 social conflicts, and 70% of those conflicts, 70%. So there are currently 200 conflicts between people and the state, and 70% of those conflicts are environmental related, climate related.
Acerca de, entonces, ¿cómo vamos relacionando el cambio climático y las desigualdades? A nivel general, el cambio climático lo que puede generar es la intensificación de los fenómenos naturales. Y nosotros tenemos una política ambiental muy frágil, pero también una política de prevención casi nula, donde tenemos una prácticamente forma de actuar que es reactiva. Respondemos cuando el daño ya se genera, lo cual ha producido, por ejemplo, el año pasado, este año, debido a la presencia del fenómeno del Niño, lo cual se pensó que iban a ser lluvias intensas, pero no fue así. Sin embargo, los agricultores, pensando que se iba a reproducir un fenómeno similar al año 98, dejaron de producir, lo cual implicó que hasta la fecha ya no tengan oportunidad de siembra, debido a que la lluvia en Perú se genera entre enero, marzo o mayo. A partir de ahí, es muy difícil para muchas zonas acceder a agua para poder tener una siembra, así sea autoconsumo familiar.
Perfect. So now making the link between climate change and inequality, what ends up happening is that there are a lot of natural phenomena that are intensified through these different policies of inequality that exist. And in Peru, there isn't a policy or there isn't an approach that tries to prevent. Instead, it's very reactionary. A good example is what just happened with El Nino. So producers, with this last year that just happened with El Nino, they actually thought that they were going to be having a lot of rain, same kind of levels as in 1998, around there. But they didn't actually have the same amounts of water and the same amounts of rain as in those previous years. So what did they do? They actually didn't seed as much, and their livelihoods were thrown into complete chaos because they didn't get the water that they expected to get in January, March, and May.
Bien, señalar también que el impacto se produce de forma diferenciada, no es igual la forma como están preparados hombres y mujeres. Nuestra sociedad sigue siendo muy desigual y las mujeres continuamos, a pesar de tener voz y voto, lo cual son grandes victorias para nosotros, seguimos en un proceso de marginalización y de estereotipos en cuanto a cómo se comercializa el cuerpo de la mujer y cómo se vende esto. Y esto a nivel territorial, consideramos la importancia del enfoque territorial para formular políticas, para formular acciones, implica varios desafíos. En las comunidades, en muchas comunidades del Perú, andinas o amazónicas, diversas mujeres pueden participar de una asamblea, pero por lo general todavía no tienen voto. Solamente en ocasiones pueden firmar a nombre del esposo.
Now, making the connection between climate change, inequality, and gender, women are definitely affected in a more adverse way than men in a lot of these situations. They often aren't given the same voice. They're often marginalized, stereotyped, objectified, their bodies. And another theme that's not very considered is territory and forming policy and action based on this notion of territory and space. A lot of the time women are, yes, invited to assemblies, are present in assemblies, but they actually don't have a vote in those assemblies. So these are all kind of environmental impacts that affect them more strongly.
Por último, señalar el tema de la pérdida de los ecosistemas. Nosotros tenemos en el Perú ecosistemas cuencas que están perdiendo su capacidad de producir, no tienen áreas verdes debido al crecimiento urbano. En Lima hay 3 cuencas que son urbanas, los cuales ya han perdido de un 80 a un 90% de toda su área verde. Eso implica, así como en otras partes, ¿qué va a pasar cuando las familias que viven bajo la línea de pobreza, pero no llegan a extrema pobreza, lo cual es beneficioso para las políticas porque no tienes gran población en extrema pobreza, pero es gente pobre? Entonces, ¿qué va a pasar cuando las ciudades siguen creciendo sin planificación? No tenemos un ecosistema, tenemos cada vez mayor presión sobre los ecosistemas, perdemos bosques, perdemos fauna, sin embargo, las políticas continúan esquivando esto. Y lo que se tiene ahora, todavía, a pesar que ya hay intentos para incorporar el enfoque de cuenca, todavía hay una mirada muy vertical sobre cómo se llevan los procesos participativos y cómo se incluye la población.
I don't know the translation for cuecas, but perfect. Thank you. It's a team effort. So, a working group. Wonderful. So there's still not a lot of policy, there's still just not a lot of policy that exists around watersheds. And what ends up happening is that a lot of people who are actually living around cities or living in like the peri-urban areas who are under the poverty line but not actually in the extreme poverty category are more adversely affected. City planning doesn't really take into account ecosystems, the conservation of fauna, flora, and so on. That one was a bit more summarized.
Como les decía, entonces los jóvenes marchamos, protestamos, están saliendo. Sin embargo, todavía hay una débil articulación entre las demandas de los grupos juveniles. No obstante, hay un gran interés en cambiar las cosas. Y eso ha generado que actualmente cada vez se desarrollen y se generen mayores iniciativas, como lo que hoy estamos haciendo incluso en Tierra Activa, que es elevar el nivel de integración a nivel latinoamericano, con Colombia también y con Bolivia.
So what are young people doing in front of all of these inequalities and this climate change? They're getting out in the streets, they're marching, they're protesting, but there's still a lack of articulation between different social movements. There is a desire to change things and to articulate better. And Tierra Activa is a good example of a kind of a regional movement that's taking place.
Estas son imágenes de las marchas que se produjeron en el Noa Keiko, así como también algunas en el marco de la ley Culpín y otras que tienen que ver con la lucha por exigir que se cumpla las reparaciones a las mujeres, por ejemplo, que fueron esterilizadas a la fuerza en el Perú, en el gobierno de Fujimori, en la dictadura.
So here we have a few pictures of different protests. We have one which is no to Keiko, the dictatorship. We also have the Putin, the very controversial taking away, stripping of labor rights for young people. So that was another protest. And when Fujimori, the father of Keiko, was in power, he actually forced women to get sterilized. So there was a lot of social movements around that too.
Entonces, nosotros consideramos que debemos buscar un cambio sistémico, no climático, debido a que nuestros problemas no solamente van a ser resueltos con mencionar que la solución está en lo ambiental, tenemos que ver el aspecto político, económico.
So, yes, we need to change things on a systemic level, not just on the climactic level, is what Maria is saying. And we can't just see, the climate change debate as this separate kind of subject, but that's actually integrated with a lot of the other social movements that she was talking about during her presentation. It is about gender, it is about, work, livelihoods, it's about a number of different factors.
Sí, les quería comentar a lo que estamos haciendo ahora, que, bueno, los jóvenes están desarrollando iniciativas como son diálogos sobre ecología, pero también tenemos unas marchas el viernes, dentro de 2 días, el 13, que es Ni Una Menos, que se está sumando a la violencia de género que hay casi en todos los países latinoamericanos, lo cual esperamos contar con respaldos, así sea como ahora se hace en Facebook, rechazando la violencia de género.
So one of the social movements that's very important right now in Peru is called Ni Una Menos. You may have seen people, there's the picture, Ni Una Menos. So you may have seen people out with this sign at the launch of the World Social Forum. It's all about violence against women and stopping violence against women after some very brutal specific cases of 2 women in particular in Peru, one which was actually caught on video. So it was really neat to see that the national community, civil society really banded together, Facebook exploded, and there's a lot of solidarity. But Maria is inviting everybody to the march or to do some sort of online action, social media, which is on the 13th of August.
Por último, mencionar que tenemos en abril el Foro Panamazónico, que es una de las grandes iniciativas, ya que es el llamado del bosque. Es un nombre particular porque estamos tratando de defender nuestro ecosistema y nuestro patrimonio.
And the last invitation that's kind of aligned actually with the World Social Forum is the Pan-Amazonic Social Forum. And that's going to be in Peru next year in April 2017 in the jungle in Terapoto. And everybody's invited, and that's it for Maria's presentation. Thank you, Maria. Thanks for everybody's patience. Yes, the interpretation. Now we're really excited because, we have Naomi Klein here with us, who's actually going to be doing the work of presenting a little bit of a synthesis of what we heard here today, and kind of presenting some of her points. So Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, as a lot of you know. She's a syndicated columnist, and she's also author of the international bestsellers, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, also The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo. Her most recent book, the critically acclaimed This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, was the 2014 winner of the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction, and was also a New York Times 100 Notable Book of 2014. It's now in paper book, and it's being translated in over 25 languages. I know Maria was curious if you brought some copies of the book with you so that you could sign them. Not too bad, okay. There's also a documentary that's been inspired by the book and narrated by Naomi herself, and it premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2015, and it's now available worldwide. Her column for The Nation magazine is syndicated internationally by the New York Times Syndicate. She is a member of the board of directors for 350.org, a global grassroots movement to solve the climate crisis, and a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. She is one of the forces behind Canada's LEAP Manifesto, a blueprint for a rapid and justice-based transition off fossil fuels. I know that Harjeet and Adrian were kind of touching on both of those subjects as well. The LEAP Manifesto has been endorsed by over 200 organizations and inspired similar initiatives around the world. In November 2016, she will actually be awarded the Sydney Peace Prize in Sydney, Australia. So welcome, Naomi, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to listen to all of you. I have to warn you that I'm going to have to leave a little bit before the end of the session. But I'm very, very pleased to be here. I told Soren when he invited me that I'm not a youth, so I'm not quite sure why I'm being invited to speak on a youth panel. But I was once a youth. I'll talk about that. Sorry, before I go any further, I want to say that I was born in this city. I'm originally a Montrealer. And we are on Indigenous territory. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee people, also traditional territory of the Iroquois. And I want to say how ashamed I am of the Canadian government. And I think that we are going to have to do a lot of soul searching about what it means to host a World Social Forum in the global North. And whether we can even call this a World Social Forum at all, whether we have done all we could have done to anticipate these events, or whether perhaps our pinup PM and all of the PR that has gone on around this being some kind of a new era was so successful that we were not prepared for these types of actions. So there's going to have to be a lot of soul searching and a lot of questioning to understand how we got to such a scandalous situation, which is, as the previous speakers have said, absolutely pertinent to the subject before us, right? Which at its very core is the ranking of human life, is the assigning of some categories of people as somehow less human than others. That is at the heart of the climate crisis, of our response to it, and also the creation of the climate crisis itself, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But yeah, when I was a youth, the first book I wrote was called No Logo. And what No Logo was about, really at its heart, was this shift that was going on in consumption patterns, right? Where, particularly in the 1990s, there was an explosion in what came to be called lifestyle brands, lifestyle branding. But essentially what it meant is that we were already a consumer culture, of course. We're already a capitalist culture. But as we privatized more and more of the public sphere, the role of shopping in our lives just sort of took over. And you see that reflected in the emission history, right? As Harjeet was saying, our population went up by 4%, but our emissions went up by 14%. And that's because people who were already over-consuming started super-consuming, right? Shopping as pastime, as everything, as identity, right? I mean, this is what the lifestyle branding was all about. So I sort of cut my teeth as an activist in what was called the anti-globalization movement, but which was really a movement against the globalization of that particular model of hyperconsumption, right? And I think we didn't understand, or many of us didn't understand at the time, how intimately connected that that global trade model was to climate change. I mean, it was on the radar, and we certainly understood that this was an incredibly wasteful way of running a global supply chain with these very long transit routes and fossil fuel burning ships and trucks bringing goods ever larger distances. But I think what is only really clear in retrospect, right, and is only clear once we look at what happened with emissions in this key period. And here, I rely in the book and and since the book was published, on work that's been done by a Swedish researcher named Andreas Malm, who has a new book out called Fossil Capital, where he looks very closely at an emission explosion that happened as the global trade era began, right? So in the 1990s, global emissions were going up by about 1%, an average of 1% a year. But once you get to 2000, and this is the year that China joins the WTO, that things are really in place, the emissions start going up by an average of 3.4% a year. So from 1% to 3.4% shift in one decade, right? And this is not just because we are producing more, but because that model, which was really a liberation project for capital, allowing multinationals to scour the world for the cheapest possible way to produce their goods, right? In my own work, I focus more on the labor side of the equation, right? What that meant in terms of the erosion of labor rights and the searching the world for cheap labor. But it wasn't only cheap labor that they were finding. They were also finding cheap everything, including cheap energy, right? Which overwhelmingly meant coal. And that's why we saw, one of the main reasons we saw this explosion in global emissions in this period. So I think this is the heart of it, is that we are talking about a model of overconsumption that has been globalized around the world, not to everyone in the world, but to every country in the world, even if only to a small elite in all of those countries. And I always think back to 1992, when Rio hosted the first Earth Summit. And there was a big a controversy about whether George Bush Sr., who was then president of the United States, would attend Rio. And at first he said he wasn't going to attend, but there was a lot of pressure. And eventually he announced that he would go, but said, or apparently said, that he would go, but the American way of life was not up for negotiation, right? And this is very, very key to understanding how we landed here. We will talk about climate change, we'll talk about emissions, but we will not talk about consumption. That is not on the negotiating table. And it really hasn't, it never has been, right? So we've talked around it and we've talked about everything but it, but we are certainly at the point where we can no longer avoid that conversation. And as Harjeet said, the question before us is how we move off fossil fuels very, very rapidly. In countries like Canada, if we take our historical responsibility seriously, we need to be cutting our emissions, not by 1% or whatever it is that our leaders congratulate themselves for. We need to be cutting our emissions by 10% a year. And we need to have already started this several years ago, okay? And these figures come from Kevin Anderson at the Tyndall Center on Climate Change Research in Manchester. Nobody has challenged these numbers. He's an extremely respected expert on emission reduction. There's no precedent for that kind of emission reduction short of the Great Depression, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was a brief period after the collapse of the financial crisis. You'll notice whether it's communism collapsing or capitalism collapsing, it seems to be good for emissions, but it's not good for people, right? We don't want a collapse as a way to lower our emissions. We want a great transition. It's not going to happen on its own. If we want, if as we engage in this incredibly ambitious project, right? We bring it down emissions by 10% a year. It's something that has to be planned. It is something that the only precedents for it, and they're problematic precedents, are wartime levels of mobilization, right? So if you look at the kinds of changes that happened in the North American economy, in parts of the European economy during World War I and World War II, where there were systems of rationing, where suddenly in Canada transit use went up during the Second World War by, I believe, 90%. In the US, there was an explosion of what was called victory gardens. So people were getting their fruits and vegetables in their backyards. 40% of produce was coming from victory gardens. And we all know the story about how US factories were retrofitted from building cars to building warships. Now, we don't want that kind of transition either, right? And that was a very, very top-down transition and a very statist transition. So we have to be honest that there's actually no precedent for what we're talking about. The closest would be something like a New Deal era transition, public works projects and so on, where you had both leadership from above and huge pressure from below, from social movements, leading to massive changes in a way an economy was organized. But that's what we're talking about if we're talking about lowering emissions by anything close to what scientists are telling us we need to do. So, I've been involved in this project here in Canada called the LEAP Manifesto, where we have tried to answer the question of if we took the science seriously, and if we took the engineers seriously who are telling us that actually with existing technology, we can get to 100% renewables for electricity in 2 decades and for transportation by mid-century, if we took that know-how seriously, if we listen to the engineers, if we listen to the scientists, how would we make sure that that transition was done in a way that systematically fought inequality, racial inequality, economic inequality, gender inequality, and decolonization, right? So I think that that's the task before us. And we have to be really, really honest that this is not something that's going to automatically happen just because things go green. There are all kinds of ways that a state could impose green policies that actually deepen inequality. You could, one of the things I've spent a lot of time studying is how states use crisis to do things that they would want to do under times, under normal times, but a crisis gives them the permission to, for instance, you could say, well, we need to build a whole lot of solar panels. We can't afford to have unions. You just get rid of unions. You'd say it's an emergency, right? I mean, this is familiar stuff. So if we want it to be fair, then we have to design it to be fair. And if we want to build a coalition that's strong enough to fight for that kind of a transition, then it has to mobilize sectors of the population that have been excluded, let's be honest, from a lot of progressive, so-called progressive spaces. We have to build a very, very broad coalition. And it's my firm belief that at a time of deepening inequality, right, at a time of rampant racialized violence, state violence, people are dealing with such urgent issues that they're not going to mobilize on climate unless it is clear that climate is a way of directly addressing daily emergencies at the same time, right? So we're not going to do this by saying, all right, well, first we save the planet and then we'll deal with poverty and racism and the rest of it, which unfortunately there is a tradition in the environmental movement of playing my crisis is bigger than your crisis, and well, there's no jobs on a dead planet, so let's save the planet and then worry about your jobs. That's how you really piss people off, first of all, and fracture your movement, right? So I think we need to look at how we build the strongest possible coalition and then look for these integrated solutions. So I was on a panel earlier today with a wonderful labor leader here in Canada named Mike Palachuk. He leads the Postal Workers Union. And the postal workers have worked with our little LEAP team to come up with a proposal called Delivering Community Power, where The post office is one of the public services under threat, like so many others, but the postal service is under particular threat here in Canada. Our previous government wanted to do away with home delivery completely. And the union under Mike Palaszczuk's leadership has done something I've never seen a union do before, which is not simply say we want to protect things as they are, but say, okay, you're right, we do need change. This is our vision for how we want to change the post office. We think our entire fleet should be electric vehicles. We think they should be made in Canada by our fellow workers, unionized by Unifor. We think that there should be charging stations for everybody's electric vehicle outside of every post office. They point out that there are more post offices in Canada than there are Tim Hortons. And for the non-Canadians in the audience, let me tell you, that's a lot. That's a lot of post offices. So we have this public infrastructure. And yes, the way we get our mail is changing. So let's change the post office. Let's not just give this thing away. They're calling for community banking, postal banking. And also that service, including the providing of loans for community-controlled renewable energy projects. And one of the things that we call for in the LEAP is that frontline communities, the communities that have gotten the worst deal under the extractive economy, should be first in line to own and control their own renewable energy projects, starting with First Nations. And this, brings me to what I was saying before about this inequality, racism, let's use the word, right? Being at the heart of the creation of the climate crisis, not just in how we're responding to it, but the very fact that you cannot power an economy with fossil fuels without sacrificial people and places. It's inherently dirty, inherently dangerous. This has been true since the first coal miners' lungs were sacrificed in the name of industrial progress, right? So that process of othering, sacrificing, whether it's in the Ecuadorian rainforest, whether it's the Niger Delta, whether it's indigenous communities in northern Alberta. We talk to people working in the Alberta tar sands who say, like, no one was here before we got here. Well, and by which they mean no one who counts was here before we got here. And so this has always been part of the story of fossil fuels. There isn't some magical way that suddenly you have fossil fuels without sacrificial people. So that's why I think we start there. And we also have to acknowledge, as we build the most intersectional movement possible, that just as there's no clean way to power an economy with fossil fuels, there's no peaceful way to power an economy with fossil fuels. Because by their very nature, unlike renewables, which are everywhere and free, right? Sun, wind, right? Fossil fuels are concentrated in particular locations that have this really bad habit of being under other people's lands and other people's sands. So there is this direct correlation between state violence and pools of carbon. And now what we're seeing is that many of those areas that were destabilized by oil wars are also, and this is this great historical irony that Harjeet was referring to, that they also are some of the driest areas in the world and some of the hottest areas in the world. And the Israeli architect Eyal Weitzman has this remarkable new book out called The Conflict Shoreline, where he maps the incidence of Western drone strikes and shows that they almost exactly follow what's called the aridity line, the driest lines in the Middle East and Africa. So what we have is a pattern where bombs follow oil, and then drones follow drought, and now boats follow both, right? As people are destabilized by all of this and forced to move. And then this same hierarchy of humanity colors, I was going to say, and I think that's probably an appropriate use of the word, how refugees are treated when they get to Europe or North America. And ultimately, this is about values. This is about what kind of human beings we're going to be. Because if we don't challenge the hierarchy of humanity, the racism at the heart of both the creation of the climate crisis and the casual attitude our governments have taken towards the reality of it, and the refusal to act with any seriousness, then those same values will color how we react to the migration of people, and it already is, right? So now we, one of the most vivid examples of this is in the UK, where they've had some really, really bad flooding this past winter and also 2 winters ago. And the right, the same sort of xenophobic right that riled up so much racism around Brexit, use those floods to say, why are we spending so much money on foreign aid when we have flooding at home? And literally, why are we sending money to Bangladesh when people need it, in Manchester? Now, like, one of the reasons is because they invented the steam engine and they have been emitting carbon on an industrial scale longer than anybody on Earth. But of course, that isn't even part of the conversation. So unless we are willing to have these conversations about that hierarchy, about racism, about white supremacy, then we're in for a world of trouble. And so I would just caution that yes, it is about inequality, but we have to talk about why the inequality. And I think that there's a way in which the language of inequality can cleanse the forces that make that inequality possible, palatable, livable, and unless we're willing to do that, I think things are going to get a lot worse the more people move and the more that sacrifice zone enters into the very center, right? So the idea of the sacrifice zone is this idea that, as we all know, that there was a center and a periphery, the center of the colonial imagination, right? And that the center would be safe and this periphery would be extracted or sacrificed. But now what's happening with climate change is that nobody's really safe, right? And there's a huge drought in California, and Fort McMurray burned this year, and England is flooding, and the Seine flooded. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be global solidarity unless we get at the core of that sacrifice zone mentality in a great big hurry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Now, this is probably one of the more interesting parts of the presentation from the panelists as well, because now you actually have an opportunity to ask your questions. So I would invite you to come to the front here. We'll line up. You can ask your questions to Maria, Harjit, Adrian, or Naomi, or you could have a question that actually is for all of them, since they might have a different perspective. So yeah, we'll open this time up for questions. Or contributions as well, if there were some things that you wanted to add or some specifications.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Child, Eliza Nakwit, and I'm from Abiquit, also known as Prince Edward Island, the smallest province in Canada. And I'm here with a beautiful group of youth and individuals to facilitate a workshop on the social development goals in relation to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that'll be tomorrow at 1. But I really wanted to echo, I guess, my gratitude for all of you, and I think everyone in the room as well, for this interest and for this dedication to looking at a better world. And I mean, as an Indigenous woman, I have an inherent responsibility to Mother Earth and to the water and to the next 7 generations. So I've been very fortunate to be born into a very rich and Indigenous family who have taught me my inherent responsibility as an Indigenous woman and mother. So this echoing of what you're all speaking to is very close to my heart. It's a part of who I am as a human being. And I think a lot of us can identify the commonalities that we all hold as human beings that exist in this world. and that Mother Earth is here to support us. I've been taught as an Indigenous woman by my mother that Mother Earth will provide everything we need to survive. And I've also been taught how to honor the water. So we say, Samguan, Yasalu, water, we love you. Thank you, water. Degni de Damanesh, we respect you. So those are really basic Indigenous prayers straight across Turtle Island. And I really feel that when we honor our water, we honor ourselves. And that the water is a true reflection of where we are in our world. If we look out here outside Montreal at our water, what is the state of that water? And if we just take a moment to reflect about the state of our water throughout the world, it says a lot to us. It's reflecting back the condition of our Mother Earth and society and our irresponsibility as human beings. And so I just wanted to really echo the importance of your work and really thank you with the deepest part of my spirit for acknowledging the Indigenous people and to also acknowledge that the World Social Forum is happening here on Indigenous land and what is our story and our history. And this is something we're working really hard to bring into our school systems here. And running in for PEI, which is a really big deal for Indigenous women. And so it's a long shot, but by doing these things, we're trailblazing, and we're hoping that more Indigenous people will take these positions because it's our insight that will really make the changes that we want to see. And I think an Indigenous perspective is a really great place to start. And thank you for bringing your story and what we share in our story and our struggle as an Indigenous person or an Indigenous to the world. I think we have to look at ourselves all as Indigenous people. So, Walalan, thank you. Umsik Nogama, all my relations.
Thank you so much. And maybe you want to actually leave the information for the event at the front table there so that people can take a look. Wonderful. Thank you. There was another question over here. Oh, no? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for speaking. That was a really, really interesting panel. And my question was more for Maria and Adrian, because I do lots of student organising in the UK and mostly around the free trade movements that are happening at the moment. But I also want to ask you how, what kind of scale of student mobilisation or youth mobilisation you had to achieve to have an effect? Because you said that you, Lafine was taken down, how many people were involved, and also during your experiences, what tactics have worked best to sort of mobilise young people? Because the people I've worked with at universities have an interest in the knowledge but have a less inclination to act. So,
Thank you so much.
¿Cuál es como la escala de trabajo y la escala de movilización necesaria para tener un impacto trabajando con las personas jóvenes y qué funcionar?
Dos cosas. La ley Pupín es importante. Movilizó quizás por encima de los 50.000, 100.000 personas en Moja. A nivel nacional prácticamente. Eso se logró gracias a una estrategia territorial y muy local, porque tradicionalmente se tiende a llevar todo el peso de los cambios sociales, entre comillas, en la representación a través de los partidos políticos. Sin embargo, actualmente la juventud, la mayoría juventud peruana, está tratando de romper con la forma política tradicional, que es a través de partidos políticos. Hay una tendencia a la autoorganización y la ley Pulpín se logró gracias a eso, gracias a que las diferentes personas de los distritos de Lima se articularon por zonas, se denominó zonas. Esa articulación llevó una escala tras otra. La experiencia quedó. Actualmente el trabajo continúa. Todavía hay dificultades y hay limitaciones de cómo articular una gran inmensidad de gente a nivel nacional, a nivel de Lima incluso, pero lo que nosotros rescatamos es cómo la acción colectiva, el conjunto de los jóvenes, su esfuerzo, cambio. Y esto no solamente lo vemos en la ley Pulpín, sino también en la protesta y en la marcha de Keiko Fujimori, contra Keiko Fujimori, donde la diferencia de votaciones entre Keiko Fujimori y Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, que es nuestro actual presidente, fue de 40.000 votantes. O sea, de las personas que votamos en el Perú, solamente la diferencia para declarar presidente fue de 40.000 personas, lo cual no llegó ni a 1% de diferencia. Eso significó para nosotros una gran expectativa en cuanto a que tenemos una población que quiere cambios, pero que tiene mucha desconfianza por la tradición y la herencia de violencia en el cual hemos estado.
So in some of the cases that you mentioned in your question, what they were able to do in Peru was reach critical mass. And they did this actually, so for La Ley Pulpín, this one that was really negative towards labor rights for young people, it was between 50,000 and 100,000 people protesting in the streets. So we weren't talking of a small little protest of 100 people, you know, in front of Parliament Hill or something like that. No, it was a really critical mass. And this was actually, they had a couple different strategies, but it was local and it was territorial. So even in Lima, there are different districts, and they actually separated into different zones. They became known and coined as las zonas, and each zone had their kind of self-organizing strategy. And so it was very, very local and almost like from the grassroots level in terms of how they actually managed to take down that law. Now, one of the issues that they are having is how to articulate. So a lot of the time, like the self-organizing is great, the grassroots mobilizing is great, but there's a lack of articulation between the different movements. One of the other things in terms of what worked with Keiko Fujimori, when we talk about who, like, the victory that happened in Peru, we have Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who's currently the president. He's also a very right-wing neoliberal option, but better than the fascist option. The vote, essentially, he won the vote by 40,000 votes. That's it. He won by 40,000 votes, which was less than 1%. It ended up being like 0.4 or something percent. And when we talk about the people who were out in the streets protesting against Keiko Fujimori, we're talking once again 250,000 people in that protest. So once again, it was really a numbers game, but it kind of started from the grassroots level, and that was only in Lima, 250,000 people only in Lima. And we'll let Adrian as well answer this question, because that was also directed to you, Adrian.
First of all, I don't necessarily have anyway, here are my opinions, but I think I can imagine many people in a better position to respond to your questions. But more perhaps from a conceptual point of view, I don't know. I find it's important not to reinvent the wheel, and it's important to learn from groups that are already working on it. So join groups and learn what's happening, learn what's already being done, and see how you can contribute to an ongoing process that can first help the ongoing efforts, and at the same time you develop the skills so that then you can do stuff on your own. There's always this question of like, how local do you want to act? Because the more localized you act, the greater power and influence you have. And as you start to expand in scope, it becomes harder. And then you have to coordinate, and then you have to work with other groups, which is very important. But it's more complicated, and often it it can happen kind of on a more institutional levels, often big NGOs or grassroots do it, but also, or movements, but also relationships are important here. And I find that even like big movements or international NGOs often work together because there are like key people that bring them together. So I think it's important to invest time and energy in developing those relationships. And that's another good reason why you want to join other activities. So you meet the people who are already working on the ground, and when you want to do something on your own that is related to this topic, then you can reach out to others for help. And finally, well, it's in mobilizing, it's always about, you have to develop the muscle, right? So at first, maybe it's useful to pick up small fights or like just more local, so that you start getting an idea, and then as you gain momentum, you can expand, and then as you get good at it, then you feel like you can take more.
I know it wasn't a question for me, but I've got a split, and I just wanted to say a couple more words about the role of youth in all of this. Because I think we are in a moment, actually, an incredible renaissance of youth activism and organizing in lots of different contexts. You know, you think about the movement for Black Lives in the United States and the way it is spreading around the world and putting issues on the agenda, forcing all political actors to respond. It's just amazing, and it's a youth, not exclusively a youth movement, but it's certainly a youth-led movement, overwhelmingly women. In the climate sphere, the role of young people has been huge. Just really in calling bullshit and a lot of, and just using the moral power of intergenerational justice, right? Adrian, one of the groups that he worked with in University Earth in Brackets, has been an incredibly powerful force in these UN negotiations. One of his, I don't know if you colleagues, friends, mentors maybe, I quote at the beginning of This Changes Everything. Her name is Anjali Apadura. She's Canadian, but she went to College of the Atlantic, as Adrian did, a remarkable school. And she was the youth delegate at the Durban UN Climate Summit 4 years ago, I believe. And Anjali stood up in front of, Anjali is here, by the way, at the World Social Forum, at the Global North Social Forum. And she gave this incredible speech, which you can find on YouTube. But there was this moment where she said, well, I'm here to speak on behalf of all young people in the world, because there's one slot, right, for a young person. And she said, you've been negotiating all my life, right? And it was just, I still get chills, right? And especially for us in Canada, now we've got a prime minister very good with the words, that ability to say, we've had it with the talk. We've heard enough, we're out of time, is something we can all say. But I think when young people say it, and to see a young woman aged 21 say, you've been negotiating all my life to every country in the world, that says a lot, And the fossil fuel divestment movement, the moral force of young people in their colleges and universities saying to their school administrators, including here at McGill, which scandalously responded with quite a lot of indifference, but that doesn't mean that nothing came of it, because it really started a conversation, a moral conversation. Young people saying, your job is to prepare me for the future. How can you prepare me for the future at the same time as you bet against that future by investing in fossil fuel companies that have 5 times more carbon in their proven reserves than is compatible with the 2-degree temperature target, let alone 1.5, right? So this movement, was started less than 4 years ago. There's now $3.4 trillion worth of wealth that is part of the divestment movement, pools of money that have pledged not to invest in fossil fuels. It's spread incredibly quickly. And we are also seeing the effect of this youth activism and that moral voice that young people have, it changes the U.S. election debate, certainly within the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders has essentially taken the platform of the climate justice movement and just made it his platform. No fracking, no fossil fuel extraction on public lands, no taking fossil fuel money, so divesting politics from fossil fuels. He pushed Hillary on Arctic drilling, on Keystone. She had to change her position on both of those. And then, if you recall those sort of viral videos, 21, 22-year-olds coming up to Hillary on the campaign trail going, why are you taking money from fossil fuel companies? How much money have you taken from fossil fuel companies? And Hillary going, I'm so sick of it and all of that, right? But it's changing the conversation and it's not over. So I would just say that I think it's been really remarkable. The reason why I'm on the board of 350 and really dedicated to that organization is part of it. It started as a club at Middlebury College. 7 young people, 7 undergraduates started a club on greening their campus, and it turned into this global climate change movement. And I think that's a really amazing example of what young people can do when they put their minds to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. The Ni Una Menos. So this is the big social movement right now in Peru, and
sorry, we're having a quick social media break.
talking about utilizing social media for advancing climate change social movements. So this, remember, it's the 13th of March, or 13th of August. Wow, 13th of August. All right.
Keep writing.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Have a good trip. All right, do we have other questions for the panelists? Or comments or anything else that anybody wanted to ask? And also, before you leave, don't forget to sign the sign-in sheets that are just at the exit of the door. Yes. Oh, yes. And there's actually some University of Ottawa students who are doing a survey on the World Social Forum. These 2 young ladies in the middle, they're going to be having a little space over here. It's just a series of questions on the World Social Forum and your experience and so on. So if you wanted to participate in the survey, it would be great. The other thing that we'd encourage you to do is take a look at some of the material. So a lot of the panelists who you see here today have brought material from their respective organizations, their social movements. I know Maria and Adrian and also Harjit were talking to you about some of the different collective actions that are going to be happening. So take a look at that online. I don't know if the panelists had any last words to contribute.
We'll be here if people want to talk.
Yeah, we'll also be here. If you guys wanted to ask some questions to people individually, feel free. Yes?
Go for it.
A question. You can come here and use the microphone.
That's okay. I can talk.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny, and I'm actually an organizer at Friends of the Earth in the U.S. And I come from the fossil fuel divestment movement from my college. And I was wondering if maybe Adrian or Maria or Harjit, any of you, could speak to, I guess for me, it's always been a conflict of do I act locally or I work a lot on international issues. We're starting a palm oil divestment campaign similar to the fossil fuel divestment campaign to act in solidarity with our Global South Friends of Earth partners that are fighting palm oil companies in their countries, like in Indonesia, in Guatemala, and Nigeria. So I'm organizing students and professors in the U.S. to take their investments away from palm oil companies. And this is, I think, like Naomi said, a moral, way to take action in solidarity, and also has real impacts. But I think it's also a very abstract issue that sometimes we feel like we're not connected to. And I think it's important to take action locally because you have more power.
But I do think we do live in a globalized world, so we do have to realize that our actions will have a global impact. So how do you, I guess, deal with the issues of how to act internationally or take action internationally in the right way? And do you think, we have more responsibility to take local action or global action?
So the global versus local. Maybe we'll switch the order a little bit and start with either Adrian or Harjeet.
Kind of a similar question, but it has some interesting additional stuff. Personally, I think it's great that you are doing something in solidarity, organizing something in solidarity to a problem that perhaps doesn't affect you directly, but you still, your group still thinks that there's a more responsibility to act. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. One of those is, because a lot of resources are extracted in somewhere else, so it's important to take responsibility on it and be like, I'm not saying you, but it's kind of like you pushing your society, your country, to take responsibility on those resources that are being extracted. And it definitely resonates in other countries when you know that there's support at home. Because imagine the opposite situation, where people in the place where these resources are being extracted, but the company is not based in that country. Like, how you can't go to the parliament of the other country to mobilize, but you have other people doing that for you. Is quite powerful. On the other hand, there is an important aspect of kind of changing the narrative, the stories we tell to each other when you can act in solidarity with someone else. Or for someone else, is that the idea that it kind of goes against this notion of not in my backyard kind of activism, and I think that's very dangerous. The idea of like, it's not necessarily I'm not against fracking. I'm not against fracking in my territory, doing somewhere else, and that is definitely related to what Naomi was saying about ordering. You can only exploit others if you don't see them as your equals. So kind of like doing something to try to rally people around for a cause that that affects others. I think at the same time it's pushing people to have a conversation on like, oh, actually we can't, we shouldn't be ordering to others. If we don't want that for ourselves, it shouldn't happen anywhere. And there are some groups that have adopted this kind of rhetoric, I think in France, especially, the pas ici, nulle part, like not here, not anywhere. I think that's the kind of framing that we should use for any issues. Yes. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I don't think that there is a dichotomy. You don't have to choose between either local or global. And that's, I think, sometimes we think that might be the case, but really, if we find where to intertwine, to connect these activities, then actually becomes more powerful, because you can draw more people to the causes you care about if you are able to connect with their causes. And that's not just about climate. Expand, talk like gender, race, economic justice, and all of these things are connected. And if we can talk about them in a cohesive way, it's going to change how we imagine them. Not just like isolated issues, but all of the same.
You've covered a lot what I wanted to say. If I understood your question correctly, or if I try to analyze that, I think there are two parts. One is the moral part that you are asking about, and second is probably the strategic. But on the moral side, I totally agree with Adrian. There is no problem, but at the same time, there's no problem in acting on behalf of people. But if only we act on behalf of them and don't allow any space, any opportunity to them to come forward and lead the whole issue, I think then there is a problem. So how do we do that? From an action point of view, we make sure there are times. Right now I'm sitting here and I'm speaking on behalf of people, but at the same time, at the local level, we do invest a lot in building their leadership and raising awareness about some of the global issues which they don't have. access to. So it's about continuously investing in their leadership, and that's how we kind of balance. And if you're based in the United States and you find companies that are extracting from other places, so of course you have to target, and there is no harm in doing that. But at the same time, how do we bring people in that? And thanks to social media, it's a lot more easy. You can use technology, you can get their voices and get videos, so that it's to demonstrate that it's not just our concern and we have cooked something up. It's a real concern and how people are getting affected. We know the visa issues and all that. So of these tactical ways of overcoming that challenge. And second is strategic. And as Adrian said, most of these challenges are becoming more global or local in nature. Whether you talk of trade or let's talk of climate change, it was caused by one part of the world, another part is suffering. So in any case, we have to connect the dots across all the issues that we are working on. And if we are talking of now building a broad coalition where we are not pitting one issue against the other or one community against the other or even countries against the other. So it means that we really have to connect all these struggles and all the people. So it's our responsibility, and it's great people in the global north are taking on the companies who are violating rights in the global south. And that's the kind of solidarity we need to be working with and together. So.
A ver, nosotros por lo general trabajamos en diferentes niveles. Como mencionaba, las estrategias tienen una base, un sustento a nivel territorial, local, pero buscamos la articulación a nivel más global, por así decirlo. Eso, en la experiencia interactiva, surgió como iniciativa para discutir un espacio de jóvenes frente al cambio climático, en un contexto donde los jóvenes discutíamos, sí, de políticas, de pueblos indígenas, de territorios, pero teníamos agendas aisladas. ¿Cómo lo conectamos a un problema mayor? Cambio climático. En el 2014 hicimos un encuentro a nivel nacional, pero todos vinieron a Lima. En 2015 nos propusimos retomar y regresar a las regiones, tratando de identificar problemáticas comunes. Eso nos permite ahora haber ampliado y tener mayor conocimiento de la población e ir formando líderes, e ir construyendo capacidades de los jóvenes. Actualmente estamos trabajando en una propuesta más latina, en trabajar en una articulación a nivel más latinoamericana, porque tenemos problemáticas comunes y eso nos lleva a identificar que también podemos tener soluciones quizás replicables en otros lugares. Creo que no es mejor ni lo local solamente, ni lo global solamente. Necesitamos una conexión. Estamos en una sociedad globalizada, donde la economía es global, la cultura se comercializa de forma global. Yo soy antropóloga. La cultura tiene, la identidad de las personas cada vez es múltiple, los jóvenes son múltiples, tienen múltiples agendas, responden a múltiples necesidades y tienen múltiples problemáticas. Entonces, pasamos de considerar la juventud no solamente como una palabra, sino como un modo de vida, como algo que actualmente estamos en un bono demográfico, donde casi 30% del Perú es joven, tiene menos de 25 años o hasta 28, en algunos casos que lo consideran como Oxfam hasta los 29. Pero de aquí a 20 años, a más tardar, que vamos a tener un colchón de población que sobrepase los 40 años sin ningún tipo de seguro ni de vida, ni de calidad de vida. Ahí eso se convierte en un problema no solamente local, sino también latinoamericano y regional, y probablemente vaya escalando posiciones. Entonces ahí, y bueno, una cosa que me llamó la atención, Canadá, por ejemplo, un país muy interesante, muy bonito, pero también la gente te pide dinero en cada esquina, en cada parada del tren, aunque claro, no tanto como México, ¿no? Porque uno está en México y no puedes caminar una cuadra sin ver personas en condiciones no tan buenas, pero Pero eso nos invita a la reflexión, ¿no? ¿Qué está pasando con los indígenas canadienses? He tenido la oportunidad de escuchar un baile y un canto indígena, de ver y escuchar. Me parece increíble. Quisiera conocer un poco más de ello, pero tenemos, creo que, problemáticas en diferentes escalas, pero que vivimos y nos impacta a nivel nacional, a cada país, de diferentes formas, pero que no estamos libres ni de la explotación, ni de la minería, ni de la contaminación ambiental, ni los problemas de agua, a pesar que Canadá tenga mucha agua y se pueda consumir el agua de caña directamente, cosa que en Perú no pasa eso. Y en Perú más de 1 millón de personas en Lima no tiene acceso a agua potable, compra agua, y esa agua que compra tiene bacterias muchas veces y es de mala calidad, lo cual implica un problema de salud, como es la desnutrición también a causa de ello. No hay problema local, tampoco únicamente global, hay que mirar la intersector, cómo lo conectamos, cómo hacemos algo más holístico, sistémico.
Right, so she's kind of complimenting a lot of what Adrian, my brain is going to explode. She's complimenting a lot of what Adrian and Harjeet have been saying, that it's not a dichotomy between the local and the global, that it's actually about finding those intersectional spaces as well, using the very specific experience of Tierra Activa, no, which is a youth space that was created to confront climate change. A lot of the time what they were realizing is that they had very local, territorial, isolated agendas, right? So they were having a hard time finding the articulations, but they still managed to scale up to different levels, and essentially having different spaces of convergence, different conference areas, where they are working at the regional, at the local level, doing leadership training in communities, kind of similar to what Harjeet was mentioning, where they're trying to come up with replicable solutions, and you know, essentially know how to confront a lot of these problems in a globalized world, where culture is transcendental, is covering different borders. And especially in Peru, where, you know, 30% of the population is youth, and they don't have a good quality of life. And this isn't a local, isolated issue, it's something that touches everybody. So just connecting, once again, a lot of those local issues to more of the global issues. And something that actually surprised her is that, you know, inequality is everywhere. She sees people, even in Canada, on every corner street in the metro asking for money, you know, and she was surprised to see this happening in Canada, a place that has potable agua water, where you can drink water from the tap, and even there, a lot of Indigenous communities still don't actually have access to potable water, to the reserves. So some of these very, you know, shocking contradictions, you know, that exist. And yeah, that's about it. Were there some more questions from the audience? Yes, in the back.
I will try to speak louder.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm French, so I'm not too good in English, you know. I'm from Paris, I'm Vincent, I'm working in a youth organization. And for those who were in Paris last year during the maybe COP21, we were quite good in the youth mobilization to mobilize people from around the world on the climate issues. But I must admit that the people who were there was more like, I mean, minority of the young people of my country. I mean, just like a real small part of my country, and people who were really involved in that kind of, and interested in that kind of issues. And we got in France a lot of young people. We are, yeah, don't give a fuck about the climate change. By the way, we had some struggle issues on the past few months, in the past 2 years, about terrorist attack and all that stuff. And my question is, how do you, it's not an easy question, but how do you reach people and convince people that the answer is like complex and you have to link climate change and inequalities when the people are looking for a simple answer to some issues like, I mean, I would say that it would be like, multi-mega terrorists. That's made so that convinces a lot of young people in my country. And it's more easier to say that terrorists are multi-mega terrorists than to explain how our political strategy on the international level made that thing happen. So how do we reach people who don't want to be convinced and don't want to be convinced by some global, complex global answers, and just prefer to reach and believe that you can simple answers to simple issues.
Thank you. And was it directed at all of the panelists or just one particular?
Yeah, we have some clues to reach people who are not convinced. I mean, we are all convinced here. How do you reach
We're preaching to the converted. Maybe, Reggie, you haven't started yet, and we'll go with Maria and then Adrian after.
That's a tough one. So you're right. People who are not engaged in these complex issues, it's very hard to retain their attention first, because having a simplified message, as you say, and which I don't want to repeat, is probably easy. And social media on one hand has a lot of good sides, but the bad side is the way these messages are flashed and people just pick up the headline. And to give you an example, the kind of messages that are going on in my own country, you find that there is no source mention, and people on social media just read the headlines and carry the same kind of now mindset, and that's getting a lot more reinforced. So what's the alternative option? One thing that we need to understand, it's going to be a long struggle. So there are no easy answers, which means that we need to spend time with youth, with everyone, with all parts of the society, and have a discourse. Again, I can draw from my own experience of working in ActionAid. We have come up with something called reflection action process, where we spend a lot of time with people. And the reason we call it reflection action, because you need to first reflect on it, which means you need to spend time and get into that discourse and then act based on that reflection. And it doesn't end there. You need to then reflect on your action and do that. So when you talk about, what even Naomi was talking about, how drones are attacking the drier areas, so it's a lot more complex issues. And you can't give or explain that in a simplified message, which means we need to create those spaces where we can have those kind of discourses. And that's why freedom of expression and having all kinds of views discussed is extremely important. As I said, while social media provides an opportunity, but it can actually become very, very counterproductive as well. So how do we use some of these new tools effectively is extremely important for all of us. And nothing beats this kind of a discourse where we are not just looking at the headlines and trying to really go deep into the issue. So it's going to be a long struggle. And if you want to mobilize people who deeply believe in these issues, that means we have to spend time with them and communicate.
Algo sencillo pero difícil a la vez, que es, así como menciona, comunicar, transmitir, es lo real. Para convencer a la gente hay que generar eventos, hay que abrir espacios. No sabemos a cuánto vamos a convencer, pero siempre se hace como una bola de nieve y se va llevando el mensaje. Realmente, en nuestra experiencia de diferentes espacios, desde la vida universitaria, cuando hicimos todo una protesta para traer la problemática amazónica a la ciudad, que no solamente es sierra, que no solamente es bosque, sino lo traemos a la ciudad, fue eso. Fue abrir espacios, debates, conexiones con todas las universidades posibles de Lima, sobre todo las más grandes, que son quienes más nos apoyan. Y eso generó que hasta las empresas que generaban contaminación minera vengan a sentarse a las universidades y a proponernos a nosotros como estudiantes en ese tiempo que vayamos a hacer una inspección de su trabajo para que nos demos cuenta que ellos no cometen ningún tipo de infracción. Pero esa es una manera de seguir curso, capacitación, comunicarse, transmitir mensajes, fotografías, imágenes, videos. y mostrándole finalmente las consecuencias y el futuro en el cual queremos nosotros tener como jóvenes o como personas en general, cómo queremos llegar más adelante, preparados o no.
Perfect. So what Maria is saying is that it's all about opening spaces, creating events and activities, but these very inclusive spaces where you're able to actually reach a lot of different people. And in that way, you have kind of a snowball effect. So one example is obviously not everyone in Peru is affected by the petroleum, by the oil spills that are happening in Amazon or anything that's happening in the Amazon. So what did the organization that Maria works for, Alternativa, what did they do? They actually had a number of university events where they were bringing that theme, which came from, which was totally disconnected from a lot of the people living in the city in urban areas, but where they actually opened spaces of discussion and they invited people from different sectors. It was a very intersectorial space where even some of the companies were invited to this space. And in that way, you actually manage to reach a new public, and it's not necessarily that you're trying to jam or convince people, but you're actually creating an open space of dialogue where people can actually come and learn, and you're accessing new publics.
I think I'm basically on the same line. It's a tough one. If there was a simple recipe, we wouldn't be struggling with with the issues. A lot has to do with stories we tell, and it is hard for a racist story to become kind of to spread like fire and unchallenged when you have other stories well established in the imaginary of people that contradict this story. And you can find some communities and many groups in Europe. You're probably aware of this, but like there are certain cities, entire cities, and municipalities that have taken a very, very different attitude towards the arrival of immigrants. No? Hundreds of thousands opened their houses to refugees, and it didn't happen like that. It wasn't one day they realized there was this problem and they decided to welcome them, but it was like a sequence of events, like thousands of conversations, like that shaped their views. So that when push came to shove, then basically like it made sense, that step, and that just like resonates with what Harjit was saying. It's like you have to think in the long term. Like it's important to build a process that includes also many stories, and that's another reason why it's important to connect to other issues, so that you're not just working for the climate or even like for fracking, but rather for like a much broader thing that is cohesive, tells a story that makes sense. Okay, we cannot explode anybody, no matter if that is if that means treating women differently, if that means how we treat refugees, etc., or if we pass pollution to other places. So I think that's part of it. Now, another thing that Maria said, and I think it's very important, is that to make issues real and concrete. When problems were happening somewhere else, it's harder to talk to people that they don't see the problem directly. So I think, and that requires a lot of creativity. How do you make a kind of abstract or far away problem more real and concrete for the people that you need to mobilize to get stuff done? That requires creativity, but that's a good point.
Muy pequeño, pero que es muy importante. ¿Saben qué? Que es abrir los espacios, pero los mismos afectados. Que el que tiene el problema lo exponga. Porque una de las cosas que siempre hacemos es hablar por otros. Pero abrir el espacio para las mismas poblaciones indígenas, para las minorías, para las mujeres, para los trabajadores desempleados o cual actor fuese. Nosotros trabajamos en que la misma población afectada exponga su problemática junto con el debate del Estado y junto con la posición técnica. esa pluralidad genera mayor debate y mayor conciencia, porque entra cuestionamiento, cómo ir profundizar en el problema.
So what Maria is saying is that in those spaces that are being opened, it's extremely important to actually have the actors who are themselves affected by the situation present in those spaces, where they're going to be exposing, their reality, sharing some of the stories, a little bit like what Adrian was saying earlier on. And this, not just by itself, right, but also with the other stories that the state is telling, that the companies are telling, and have this plurality of stories that are being told within these spaces that are being opened up. So we're out of time. It's a long session. So if any of you have any questions, just come and talk to us individually. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at noon for the protest against a lot of people from the Global South who were refused visas for the World Social Forum. The information is on the board back here, and there's a bunch of information as well at the tables. And thank you so much to the panelists, Maria, Harjit, and Adrian. Thank you so much for your presentation.
If you haven't signed in, please do so here. I'll put another sheet over there. If you have one of the sign-in sheets that was circulating, please bring it back.
Yeah, there was one question, but it seems to be all right. Just skip it if they were in time. It was, I mean, on the internet. It was crazy. 9 people at, at the most busy time.
Is there anything else?
Great.